Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Phil Ponce on this Thursday, April 5th. 6 weeks before NATO meets here in Chicago, some history. NATO was born out of the Cold War as a way to curb Soviet power. But what does the alliance mean today? Is it a peaceful coalition of 28 countries working together to ensure global security, or has it become a police force that acts largely in the interests of Western nations? Joining us to look at NATO's role are Ahmed Rehab, Executive Director of the Chicago Chapter of the Council on American-Islamic Relations, and Josh Kleinfeld, Assistant Professor of Law at the Northwestern University Law School. Gentlemen, welcome to Chicago Tonight.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
First of all, what key topics, let's bring it local, what key topics do you expect NATO to take up during the meeting here in Chicago?
One will certainly be the drawdown in Afghanistan. NATO wants to get its troops out and wants to make sure Afghani security forces are capable of taking over. So does the U.S. And that drawdown of troops has to be managed. Another likely topic is the uprising in Syria and the aftermath of the Libya intervention.
So, two key topics, but Ahmed Rehab, my understanding is that the larger issue that's facing NATO right now, in addition to those very important specific ones, are under what circumstances will NATO intervene? What are your concerns about that?
Well, you know, yesterday marked the 63rd anniversary of the birth of NATO. And as you rightfully mentioned in the introduction, it was born out of a desire of Western nations to protect themselves against a potential Soviet threat. It was largely defensive in terms of its goals. It was a mutually defensive pact. We've seen that change over the years. I would argue that today it's not necessarily direct defense that NATO engages in, but in many cases, aggression. Now, not to say that it's evil aggression. It could be an aggression that's necessary. That's a different debate to be had. But still, it's the differentiation between defensiveness and being aggressive, as we have seen in Afghanistan and in Libya.
Josh Kleinfeld, do you accept that distinction?
Well, I have a different view of it. I think NATO has a deeply important defensive mission today. You know, NATO is based on a treaty. And the treaty has an article that promises that an attack on one is an attack on all. That's the key defensive provision. That has been invoked once in the 63-year history of NATO, and it was on September 12, 2001, the day after the September 11th attacks. And what followed that was extensive cooperation among these Western democracies that make up NATO in defending against terrorism. So NATO is a cooperator in the work in Afghanistan against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. There's intensive intel sharing and cybersecurity efforts and other efforts that have to do with defensive work against current threats.
How about that? Are those so-called defensive components a key part of some people might look at those as interventionist, but is there a relationship between the defensive posture and some of these steps that might be termed more aggressive?
Well, the problem here is one of subjectivity. Who gets to define what is a moral definition for an intervention? In the case of Kosovo and Serbia, yes, in Serbia there was mass killings, genocide against Bosnians, and that may have been merited. But then the question becomes, in the case of the French aggression against the Algerians in the 50s, after the birth and the creation of NATO, there was no involvement, obviously, France being a member of NATO. So you get to see here a situation where people around the world are asking who defines what is moral and immoral, and what kind of standard exists that is not hypocritical, but rather...
Josh Kleinfeld, is there a standard by which NATO makes the decision whether or not to intervene in identical situations or similar situations where the humanitarian needs might seem equal?
Well, there is, first of all, a legal basis for NATO intervention, and that's a Security Council resolution. So in the case of the recent NATO intervention into Libya, there was a request from the Arab League for an intervention. The Security Council, which has the authority to authorize the use of force in international affairs, the Security Council passed a resolution calling for the use of force and invoking its authority to do so, and NATO acted on it.
Ahmed Rehab, was that an appropriate intervention given those circumstances?
Not necessarily, and here's another problem that we need to raise.
It was requested by the Arab League, and even though it was sanctioned by the UN.
The Resolution 1973, coming out of the Security Council, talked about a no-fly zone. It did not stipulates in direct words a military intervention of the sort that we saw from NATO. Moreover, when that occurred, when there are civilian targets, and there were 22 and 100 civilians were killed by NATO forces, this was the result of investigation by a United Nations commission that's posted on their website. There is no route for accountability. And that's the problem when you have a hegemonic force like NATO that works with impunity. It can, when you have when you have people who die as a result of that, there is no recourse for them to try to bring about justice.
Is it a hegemonic force, Josh Kleinfeld?
Well, that's not how I see it. There are 28 states that compose NATO. All of them are democracies, and they need to be unanimous for NATO to take any action whatsoever. To me, that's far from the definition of a hegemon. That's a multinational alliance of democracies. And in this case, in the Libyan case, they were working directly in response to requests from the Arab League, and they were working on a legal basis from the Security Council.
You have talked about the importance of Turkey as a counterbalancing perspective. What do you mean by that?
Well, Turkey is a member of NATO, as is Greece, and Turkey tends to have, I would say, a more nuanced understanding of the concerns of the politics of the Middle East, being all the more closer to the Middle East and to the Arab majority nations. And I think that would act as a factor within NATO that tends to mitigate against the overuse of violence or the over-aggression by NATO. And we saw that in Libya. Turkey was very reluctant to go all the way with force. They just wanted enough force to be able to disable the Gaddafi forces, but not to go beyond that. And we saw in many cases when force occurs by NATO or by others, that is the start of other problems like the refugee crisis in Kosovo or the situation that we have now in Libya.
Are there any situations where NATO intervention, military intervention, is justified?
Yes, I would say it was justified in the case of preventing the massacres and the genocide in Bosnia. But then again, it has to come with accountability. It has to be pursuant to Security Council resolutions, and then when it occurs, it has to work within the bounds of international law.
Was there a UN sanction of the intervention in Bosnia? I have forgotten.
Kosovo. In Kosovo, which is the really relevant one here, there was not a direct Security Council resolution. There were some indirect ones, but there wasn't a direct one. And in fact, it's commonly said about that NATO intervention that it was illegal but the right thing to do. International lawyers like to say it was illegal but the right thing to do. And it was the right thing to do. We're talking about a genocide, just as we were talking about a mass killing, a humanitarian rights violation in Libya. When NATO intervenes to prevent that kind of humanitarian disaster, it's like intervening in it's like if it had been possible for an alliance of democracies to intervene in Hitler's Germany in the 1930s and 1940s to stop the genocide there. It's a morally justified intervention.
Has NATO become, some people say NATO has become, in effect, the world's police force. Is that how you see it?
I do, but it's not the world's police force in terms of going after any criminal activity around the world, but rather as it pertains to the security of Western nations. And a case in point is, as my colleague here mentioned, there was intervention in Kosovo, but for example, there was not any intervention in Cambodia, where there were massacres that were probably more horrendous in terms of the number of casualties, because there was no direct effect on the security of Western nations that were involved in NATO.
Is that a fair comparison?
Well, the problem is it's impossible for NATO to intervene everywhere that there is a humanitarian disaster. It doesn't have enough resources. It doesn't have the money, the men, or the power. So it has to pick and choose. I think calling for it to intervene in every case in which there's a humanitarian disaster is asking for a sort of spurious logical consistency, when in fact international relations are complicated. And sometimes it's practical and sometimes it's not practical to intervene.
So what should be the guiding light for NATO, and do you expect any of that to be taken up in Chicago?
Well, I accept, first of all, what my colleague just said in terms of NATO cannot possibly intervene in every possible humanitarian crisis, but then we need to be able to acknowledge that in our critique and our assessment of NATO, that it is not necessarily just a moral force around the world, but rather one that is very subjective, that looks out for its own interests. Oftentimes that is in line with fighting against human rights abuses, but many times it isn't, and oftentimes human rights abuses go unfought against by NATO. In terms of what will be discussed in Chicago, it's difficult for me to predict that, but I would say that they're not going to go back and try to redefine the statutes of NATO and what NATO ought to be and ought not to be.
NATO has to look forward in terms of their limited resources and in light of the changing face of what are perceived as threats. You expect those to be on the table?
Absolutely. So the traditional idea of a military threat is an attack by a state upon another state, upon a member state of NATO. But in today's world, a lot of the worst threats come from non-state actors like terrorist organizations, comes from cybersecurity threats, and related kinds of security threat, which is not directly, as they say in the international community, force to force.
Gentlemen, that's where we'll have to leave it. Ahmed, Rehab, and Josh Kleinfeld, thank you both for being here. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
And you can find out more about the NATO Summit, its agenda, and more on our website. Just go to WTTW.com/Chicago Tonight and click to our NATO in Chicago page.